to think of starting a new ministry, but say, but let's not forget or be blind to this other segment of our population, the internationals among us. And speaking of internationals among us, the Bible does tell us that we're to love the foreigner or the stranger or the alien in our midst as if they're one of our own. And I want to be obedient, so I took that command literally, and I married a former international student, Lisa, over there.
Yeah, my name is Lisa Espinelli-Chin, and I'm the National Director of the International Student Ministry of University USA.
Great. And if you read the announcement for our workshop, my name is Leighton Chin. It also says it here. But, I thought I would serve God most effectively as a non-professional Christian worker, a layperson. And I also thought I would serve God perhaps more strategically outside the United States, somewhere perhaps where there wasn't as much opportunity to hear the gospel. So I went overseas after graduating from college to Asia, teaching conversational English, and had a ministry among my fellow teachers, not the students that I taught English to, but the teachers after school. Very fruitful, productive time. I really thought, this is it. I can spend the rest of my life here. God had another plan. Brought me back to the United States, at which point I thought, well, maybe I should get some further biblical instruction or training. I went to a seminary, not Trinity, outside of Pittsburgh, great school. But anyway, I went to another seminary, and in my second year there, I had a great desire to go back overseas, and yet I never felt released from what I thought God had impressed upon me, which is to stay in this country. So in that period of bewilderment and confusion, wanting to go overseas, but not feeling that I could return overseas where my heart was, I met somebody working with international students. And that was my first time to become aware of it. Never ever thought of that. To make a long story short, this morning's passage in Matthew 9:35-38 talks about seeing the multitudes, and God and Jesus being brokenhearted over it. Well, that summer during seminary, I was volunteering for a local church in their ministry to international students, and my heart was broken because I realized much of the church in North America really hadn't seen international students as a tremendous strategic opportunity for global missions right at home. And that's how God called me into a so-called full-time Christian ministry. So as our people look out and they do see the multitude as helpless and maybe depressed and despondent and hopeless and so forth, they see many different kinds of sheep. And for us, we're looking at the foreign-born coming among us. God continues to send in increasing numbers internationals among us. Perhaps we have around 45 million immigrants. In the last 5 years, we'd had over 1 million immigrants legally becoming naturalized. So we have about 45 million legal immigrants, plus another, 11 or 12 million undocumented or illegal. So we don't know. Many immigrants and refugees. In addition, we have perhaps close to 1 million international students, if we consider and include in that number English language students before they get into regular classes and postdoctorates, and so all levels of students, maybe approaching 1 million. So here we are, a growing opportunity, the continuing demographic shift, what I call the browning of America. So many coming from south of the border or from Asia. But of course, another new influx of Eastern Europeans and so forth. And I'm glad to see that at least within the Anglican Missions Network, they are aware of this. They're offering this session, not only this workshop, but tonight we're going to hear David expand more on ministry among internationals. But even as you would open your packet here, not that you do it now, but when you do, you're going to come across several items in there. One of them is 6 different ways or so to get involved in missions. When you open it up, there's one called Welcoming. It's all about reaching international students. I didn't ask Sharon to do that, but I'm very glad to see it's there. Yeah, and she is, absolutely. And then when you talk about getting the most out of new wineskins, when you flip it over, talk about a 5-year strategic plan. They have immigrants and international students. Hooray! I wish more denominations had stuff like this, at least to call their people to this growing reality for global missions, global but local, yeah. or as it's now becoming known, and there's a growing movement, it's called diaspora missiology. Really picking up after the Jewish diaspora, but now just applying it to all those who leave home and reside abroad, whether permanently, like immigrants or refugees, or temporarily, like seamen or business people or diplomatic people, or international students. Here among us for a while, many of them will go home either immediately after graduation or maybe a few years later, but many of them will return home and become people of influence. So we do see, even in the prayer calendar, they have you praying for David and myself and Lisa, those working with international students. And just 3 weeks ago, we met a Rwandan student, freshman at a nearby university, and his name is Theo, and he's even mentioned in here. When I just met him and found out, you know him?
Had lunch with him today, told his story, it was awesome.
Praise God. We just met him 3 weeks ago. When I heard he was Anglican, I said, he ought to come to this Wineskins, and he came with us, and he's in here. So when he registered, Sharon said, you're in our pages. This is the next best thing to being in the book of life. Okay. Well, I say who because there's so much to cover, and I really want us to move on. And I'm just, pardon me, but you know, the strategic nature of reaching international students is so rich and varied, and I want to let us capture that. So when I say pardon me, I'm going to kind of read real quick some of these strategic elements of reaching international students. So they're continuing to come among us. The church is beginning to catch the vision, and they're seeing that students and scholars are already here and now. They're on our campuses, in our communities, and in our churches. We do not need to wait to go somewhere over there in the future. We do not need to get a visa, medical exams, and vaccines, or purchase a plane ticket. They're here with us right now, and they're continuing to come. They're sufficiently conversant in our language in order to study in our schools, or by the way, I'm going through this quickly. I can send this to you. I'll give you my emails, so it's all, just listen up. But they may be in our language institutes to enhance their learning of our language, and they appreciate the opportunity to practice our language with us. And while we do not need to be fluent in their native language, we could have them teach us some expressions of their language. Last Sunday, I was in McDonald's in California, and across from me, a Chinese and a white American, and they had like grammar text. I said, oh, that's great. This American's teaching some basic English to this Chinese. So as they were leaving, I said, excuse me, were you helping him with his English grammar? He said, oh, no, he's teaching me Chinese. Ah, reverse. Wonderful. Okay, so we can go both ways, helping each other. International students are generally curious to learn about our culture, our history, our country, our city, our community, and may wish to have friends who can be cultural mentors to them. They are often more open, curious, and responsive to learning about Jesus Christ while living abroad, such as we have seen among the Chinese and Japanese over the years. They're freer to consider the gospel if they are away from a restrictive society, culture, and religion that is hostile towards Christianity. They are often from unreached people groups where the church does not yet exist or is in an infant stage. International students are appreciative of hospitality, and they welcome relationships of mutual intercultural interaction, as well as the intergenerational social context of host families where younger children, parents, and grandparents are valued along with their peer-age adults. They are the potential world leaders politically and in their professions, nation builders, and transformation agents. Most graduates eventually do return home sooner or later and often grow into deep leadership positions. Among the Christian returnees, we find that they're very significant in establishing the universal church. And I saw this acted out in Malaysia and Singapore, where so much of the very top evangelical leadership today were developed in discipleship in Australia back in the 60s and 70s. And you can see this in other patterns, but I noticed that particularly in Malaysia and Singapore. There was a student named John Sung, came to the United States from China in the mid-1920s, came to Christ here, had a couple PhDs, went back though, and became an evangelist, and a revival broke out in China. About the same time, in the 20s, there was a Sikh student named Bak Singh who came to Christ while he was with the host family in Canada. I say that for our friend from Canada here. And went back and planted 500 congregations, and even today people are studying his methodology of church planting. We have 200 congregations in Pakistan, Europe, and North America fashioned after what Bach Singh did back at that time. Well, those are examples from, 80 years or so ago, and we have more examples, of course, today, and David will probably get to share about some. And one of the people that's going to share is going to come here, right? Okay. Now, international students are informants and instructors that could advance the missions movement. Two, what I call mega shifts in missions happened because of international students. One happened about in the late 1800s, and it started what's called the student volunteer movement, which resulted in over 22,000 Americans going abroad and about 80,000 people supporting them back home. But it all started with college students. Why? There was this conference, and we had about 250 students there. 10 were from other countries out of the 250. And during the conference, under Dwight L. Moody, if that name may ring a bell for some, they allowed these 10 students to share for perhaps 5 minutes about the need in their country. It was sort of the Macedonia call by these 10 students saying, come over and help us in my country. By the end of the conference, 100 out of those 250 students volunteered if God so led them to become missionaries. And that birthed the student volunteer movement. But why? It's because these international students shared just a little about the need in their country. The other mega shift happened in 1974 at the Lausanne Congress on World Evangelization. How many of you have heard of Lausanne? I'm impressed. I really am. It's kind of the global evangelical leadership. Billy Graham called all these evangelists to Switzerland in 74, and they came together and they started the Lausanne movement for world evangelization. What happened there in 74, though, there was this missions professor, Ralph Winner, and he spoke about, look, the church is planted in all the continents, in many, many countries, but within many countries there are a lot of cultural groups, and they came to be called unreached or hidden people groups because there was no church among them. And that was a paradigm shift for the evangelical world, saying missions is still very much needed. A lot of cultural groups where the gospel hasn't gone, where the Bible hasn't been translated. But what brought about that eye-opening for the global evangelical family? Ralph Winner was a professor of missions at Fuller Seminary, School of World Mission. And he said, at Fuller, we've got 100 teachers and 10 students. What? 100 teachers and 10 students? How can you afford to keep the seminary going? He flipped it. He said, you know what? There are 10 professors. We have 100 students, but they are our teachers. When they come to Fuller, these are people from all these other countries. We interrogate them, in effect. Tell us about the needs in your country. And so they were informed about the mission needs around the world. And when he realized that a lot of these people groups were not being reached, he gave that message, which has turned around missions. Anyway, international students can continue to be our informants, our instructors, if we are willing to stop and listen and learn mutually. All right. International students truly has played a tremendous role in advancing missions today. International students are also the gifts of God to the host nation and the host church. There was a seminary student at Virginia Theological Seminary. He went to this well-established church in Alexandria, Virginia, and the veteran rector there came to faith because of this African student at Virginia Theological Seminary. That rector became a bishop in Pittsburgh, preceding Robert Duncan. Alden Hathaway. That's right. He came to Christ because of an African student at Virginia Theological Seminary. International students are a gift to us as well. Well, those are some of the strategic reasons, and let me just share quickly also, and then we're going to turn this over to David, the value of international students to the local church. Local churches are discovering and seeing how enriching it is to have a ministry among international students. Why? The benefits and significant global impact that's possible with just a very modest budget for international student ministry. When we began the ministry to international students at Truro formerly Episcopal Church in Fairfax, Virginia, we had no money. Just our volunteers willing to bring food for a monthly potluck and program. It started with that. Later on, we had a modest budget. Eventually, in about the 7th or 8th year, the church realized that we could actually fund a position to direct the ministry to international students, so the budget grew. International student ministry provides a tangible dimension to a church's mission vision. A lot of times we ask our people to pray for the missionaries, support our missionaries, encourage them, write to them. Absolutely. But international students and international peoples represent the opportunity for tangible involvement, for intercultural relations, for actually working with people from around the world. So that's more than just financial and prayer support. International students or internationals incorporates a broad range of church members available for involvement, from children to retirees, and utilizes their varied gifts of service, hospitality, helps, administration, teaching, mercy, evangelism, leadership, whatever your gifts may be, we can use it. Returned or retired missionaries come back home and they can extend their cross-cultural ministry when they come back home. They don't have to hang it up on the wall, you might say. We've had a number of returned missionaries with our church in Virginia continue their ministry. Many people have a desire to serve abroad but are not able to, and yet they can have a fruitful ministry without going abroad. Or in my case, I was a returned missionary. You know, I was a reluctant returnee. I wanted to be overseas, but God brought me back and then showed me why. And international students they're ready-made language and cultural teachers for us. For anybody from your church that may be going abroad, whether long-term or short-term missions, they're going abroad to study, to work, or simply for a visit. But before you go abroad, have your international students, kind of give you some pointers. Last week, a couple went to Rwanda. But this Rwandan student that we just met that you had lunch with, that couple introduced him to us 3 weeks ago because that Rwandan student was teaching them Rwandan, if that's a correct language word. But anyway, teaching them something about Rwandan language. And now they left last week for Rwanda. And now Theo is here. Anyway, yes, international students may provide a critical linkage for ministry and mission into their homeland, either personally after they return home or by giving a positive introduction and endorsement of missionaries to their family, friends, and networks. Returnees could be gatekeepers that open the door of ministry to foreigners coming into their country, to short-term missions coming from your church. The reality is that most Christians are not called as long-term professional missionaries or to be a self-supporting tent maker like I was in another country. Most of our people in our parishes. Most will remain home, but staying home does not mean we cannot engage in cross-cultural global ministry right here, right now. And here's an avenue for us to be involved in it. Just real briefly, I'm going to tell you how the ministry at our church started, and then David will pick it up and see how it's really developed. 28 years, and by the way, David, this is my confession time to my partner here. David said, our ministry began in 1984. I said, no, 85. I said 84. Last week, Lisa found records that we began in 85. You were right, I'm wrong. So publicly and forever, I confess. And he's a deacon, so he just, what's the abolition or whatever? Okay, here we go. Absolution.
That which is a deacon he cannot do. But
Oh, okay, see, I don't know.
I can set you free.
Thank you. I've got to come back into the fold. We left Virginia, 13 years ago, went to Madison, Wisconsin. Did not find an Episcopal or Anglican church to be with. But anyway, my heart's there. Set aside the commercial. We'll come back to our session. Okay, so here I was. A regional director to help churches in the Mid-Atlantic region start ministries to international students. We're doing it all across the Mid-Atlantic region. And our own church, maybe at that time, maybe a little over 1,000. Lisa and I are sitting in the pews, and we're looking out 1,000 heads, and we couldn't even count 5 black heads, whether they're Asian or African or what. I mean, it was just so few. Anyway, I thought, should we start a ministry in our own church? I mean, our church is supporting us to encourage other churches to do it. How about our own church? I thought, you know, I'll just approach John Howe, who was our rector then. And Lisa, of all things, said no. I'm thinking, that is really unusual. This is our calling. It's to encourage churches to get involved. I'm ready to approach our church, and you're telling me no? God must have just had mercy, gave me wisdom to obey her. I didn't say a thing. But 3 weeks later, the phone rings, and it's John Howe's secretary saying he's going to give a 3-message series on ministering locally. And one of them is reaching George Mason University, which is just, I don't know, 3 or so miles away, very close. And he wanted to know how many international students were in just down the road at George Mason University. So we gave him that information. But because of that phone call, I said to Lisa, that's the sign. That's the open door for us to approach John Howe and say, can our church start a ministry? So I talked to John, and John said, literally, he said, go for it. Now, go for it means you're free to share the idea, and whomever in the congregation would step forward to volunteer with you, that's your core team. So how do we start it? Well, in the sovereignty of God, a miracle happened. I'm not ordained. But an associate rector from England, from Truro, but he had gone home to England for a month, was coming back, and he says, you know, the day after I come back from England, I'm supposed to preach. You can take my place. That's the miracle, that I would be asked to take his place. So I spoke that Sunday on welcoming the stranger. And I wasn't focusing it on international students specifically, whether they're from, you know, Texas or Maine, or even Canada, North America. Welcome the foreigner that comes to our community. But to sum it up, the application of the sermon was, we're going to start a ministry to international students in the DC area. And they had in the service leaflet a list of things that they could check off as far as being interested in getting involved. To be an exploratory meeting. What are your interests? Let's think of this together. How do we reach the 20,000 international students in DC? So out of that list, we had a small core group, came together, started to brainstorm. We launched off that September at a farm. We had about 70 people show up, 70 meaning students plus host families. We all had a fantastic time. You know, the students liked it. They went back, they told their friends, and after that, always more than 70. And maybe David can tell what the numbers have been and so forth. But within 2 or 3 years, you know, I counted over 100 countries that were represented. Now remember though, I realize this may not happen in Jacksonville, although you got probably a lot of students there, in some smaller place. But anyway, and probably, I think I counted the list of volunteers. We had over 1,000, no, by that time we had several hundred. I thought it was closer to 1,000, maybe 700. People had come to some event, either our monthly potlucking program, or they were provided weekend hospitality for international students coming in to visit DC, did our English conversation program, picked up students from the subway, or just, you know, helped in some capacity. We just had so many people get involved. And God continued to bless. Several came to the Lord, and David, you bring us up to date on that as well. In fact, I think this is a good time. I could turn it over to you to really elaborate what happened. And as he comes up, let me say, although we started out as a focus on international student ministry, the church leadership realized that our own immediate community, right around the church building, was really changing with immigrants and refugees. So the bottom line is, we started out focusing on internationals, but it really evolved into a blended ministry to reaching the internationals right there, literally next door.
Thank you, Leighton.
Oh.
I'm inspired. Let's go do it.
Let's go do it. Go for it.
It was helpful for me to hear Leighton speak because I don't think I've heard all of the parts and pieces of his story before. So that's very helpful. And I'll say something about that. In some respects, some of Leighton's and my story overlaps in that I went to Bible college and was involved all 4 years in mission prayer band. And I got so jealous of classmates and others who were involved in mission prayer band who had a particular burden for a part of the world or a people group. And I would sit in front of the global map And I would sort of argue with God, and I would say, God, narrow the focus. I keep praying for the world, but please narrow the focus. I'll take a hemisphere. I'll take a continent. I'll take a slant of eye. I'll take anything. Just narrow the focus for me so I can pray more strategically and think about how to prepare. And I didn't go to a charismatic college, and that's not my background, but it seemed like what kept coming to my heart was, David, just keep praying for the world. Someday you'll know why. After graduation, I joined a group of students that went to Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia, to help a small Baptist church that had a heart for the campus, figure out how do they, as a church, build a bridge to the campus, which was walk-in distance from them. And their focus wasn't the international student. It was the kids that were already in their church family that were going to the school, and how do they encourage their college kids to have a ministry among their peers. And as I was walking on campus that afternoon, one of the afternoons as a prayer walk, I chose a dormitory to walk through that was sort of up on a hill. Has anybody been to Blacksburg? Beautiful campus. There's a dormitory called Hillcrest. And as I walked through, I began to notice the names of the doors, and I couldn't pronounce them. It wasn't Bill or Bob or Sue or Sam. It was Ebo, and it was Ching with an X, and it was all of these names, and I thought, who in the world lives here? And I came from a very white bread family, white bread church, white bread Christian college, and I felt all of a sudden I was in a multi-grain dorm. And I just knocked on one door and said, I've got to find out who's on the other side of this door. It was a Nigerian Christian. And he filled me in that was a dormitory set aside for international graduate students. And when he and I had that conversation, my prayer came back to me, because I was so frustrated that I had graduated from Bible college with an intent and a burden to go into missions, and I couldn't. I had met with so many mission agencies. I had tried to figure out what the next step was, and I really felt like a failure. And as I sat and talked with that Nigerian believer, I said, this is my answer. You said pray for the world. The world's under this one roof here. And that summer, even though the church's heart was for the American undergrad students, I spent more time in Hillcrest, in the dining hall, talking with this international student and meeting his friends and seeing that the world was here and God could use me. I didn't qualify to go abroad because I didn't learn languages well. But somehow or another, God could use me to be a friend to these international students. My story is a little bit like Leighton and Lisa's also, in that one of the students that came to Christ that summer was a freshman. She had just finished her freshman year. And as we were reaching out to American undergrads, there was a young gal that hated dorm food and hated her studies. And so she was willing to go outside and play Frisbee with the members of our team that were there for the summer and play volleyball and the other things that we were doing with students to get to know them so that we could invite them to a home-cooked meal. And one of those that came to a home-cooked meal became a very special part of that summer experience. She was our summer's toughest, absolute toughest skeptic. She asked none of the questions that 4 years of Bible college had prepared me to answer. And I felt like writing my college dean and saying, you need to sit down and talk with this girl and then design your program around her questions, because you missed the boat. And I just continued to pray for her. That at the end of the summer, God welcomed her into her family. And then 2 years later, between her junior and senior year, I welcomed her into my family as we got married on the campus. And she's here at New Wineskins for the first time. This is maybe my fifth time, but this is Kathy's first time. After 5 years of ministry at Virginia Tech with this Baptist church, where internationals were always a part of our lives, and it was a very student-focused ministry, one of the situations that took place just before we left Blacksburg was the Tiananmen incident in June of '89. And so we got to know some of the Chinese students that were really concerned for classmates that they were seeing on the news in the demonstrations that were taking place in Beijing. And we moved up to the Northern Virginia area that summer to work with a non-denominational Bible church just inside the Capital Beltway that also had a heart for campus ministry. And on our heart was still the international student. And moving to the DC area, the greater DC area, even though Fairfax was out in the suburbs, was a real culture shock for us, coming from college town Blacksburg to large suburban DC, where it was so much more multi-ethnic, so much more varied in the people that we had a chance to meet. And so our heart continued to grow for internationals. In my mind was still the idea that in order to be a real and true missionary, I had to go abroad. And we had a 3-year commitment with this particular Bible church. And we had ministries at George Mason and at Georgetown and at 2 of the community college campuses, Annandale and Alexandria, that were going on during those 3 years. And we were, what I would say, backdoor Truro people, in that Truro had a Friday night gathering for worship that we would sneak into because the church that we were working with actually had a doctrinal statement that was not neutral on the charismatic movement. It was a little bit stronger than that. So we were sort of sneaking in the back and experiencing worship really for the first time in my life. And then saying, okay, Lord, what next? You know, we had a 3-year commitment with this Bible church, and that's coming to the end. And somebody's, maybe am I? I'm trying to remember.
Can I interrupt real
Certainly.
quick? I get a text that your battery is dead and you're going to...
Oh, you go right ahead.
Thanks. I'm not going to reach in your pants, though. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I know you went to Truro and all, but...
Was Joe and Karen Dominguez, who were members at the at Truro, also working with students at George Mason University, and they were affiliated with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And so we were sort of wondering, Lord, what next? Thinking China might be the destination for us. And I went into Truro Church that evening, downstairs into the Undercroft for a dinner. Lisa and Leighton were there, and they had a Filipino stick dance that was going on. And I thought, this just looks like fun. And I looked around, and they did a roll call of nations, and there were over 20 nationalities represented in probably 100 or 110 people there. And I just thought, if I can't go to China, I would love to be a volunteer in this ministry. And the Lord did very clearly close the door for us going to China through some health issues that my wife had, and a word from the Lord from Chuck Alley, who was a priest at the time who then moved down to Richmond. And I met Leighton and Lisa that summer because my job had ended there, and Truro, in their kindness, hired me to be a gardener, which allowed me to get away from church politics for a little while. So I cared for the campus at the church, got to know Leighton and Lisa a little bit better, and joined as an assistant in the fall of '92. And so they haven't been able to get rid of me yet. Leighton and Lisa were so gracious and welcomed me in because I'm a Baptist by background, and I didn't even know what a rector was. It just sounded really painful to me. And maybe it is in some ways that didn't come to my mind at first. And I didn't know the vocabulary. I kept thinking, they need to put a glossary at the end of their hymn book or something. But they were great coaches. What God had put into our heart, Leighton and Lisa helped bring out in our lives. And over the years, the ministry has evolved and changed and has had ups and downs and ins and outs. And I think I could refine it and boil it down to really 3 words. and that is reach, teach, and release. That what a church is called to do with regard to international newcomers, regardless of what color or stripe they are, whether they're student or visiting scholar or working professional, or in our own case, a member of the diplomatic community, or an au pair, or a refugee, or an immigrant, or on, is to reach out in kindness and hospitality and love and all of the ways that Leighton elaborated on. And to pray a prayer that we have prayed as a ministry team for years, knowing that we can't serve the needs of all of the internationals that are our neighbors. We just can't. We don't have the facility or the people resources to do it. So we say, Lord, send us those with hungry hearts. And he answers that prayer in the most amazing, remarkable ways. And I remember one young man who came in once who had been a part of a Nepali secret forces, special forces that traveled with Nepali dignitaries. And when they were in the U.S., he slipped away from his attachment. He detached from his group and fed and nourished himself for a few days behind a gas station. He refused to go back to Nepal. And he noticed an older woman struggling to get gas in her car. So he offered to help. And she said, "You look hungry. Would you like to come home for a meal?" And he understood enough English to accept the invitation. 9 months later, he was still with her, eating at her table, this Roman Catholic woman. And she did something for him that just blew his categories. He grew up in an untouchable class. Missionaries came to his school when he was a child and brought children's coloring books to pass out to the children. But because he was untouchable, he couldn't touch one. He couldn't have one. He was unclean. And as in his child's heart, he said, "This isn't fair. The faith of my family isn't fair. If there's a faith out there that allows me to be equal with others, that's what I want." And when this elderly Roman Catholic woman, to help him read, took her Bible and said, "Would you hold it and read to me?" He said, "You make me feel welcome. You make me feel equal." And as he read the scriptures to her, God opened his heart and his mind. And she took him as far as she could. And how she found out about tips, I never found out that part of the story. But she sent him to tips, and he walked in and he said, "Hi, my name is BK. Can you introduce me to Jesus?" I said, "Jesus, you have answered the prayer we always pray. Send us people with hungry hearts." We sat down, we talked, we shared. Within just a few sessions, he opened his heart to Jesus. At the time, he was working illegally at a bar in Fairfax City making margaritas and other mixed drinks. And because of his science and math background, I wanted him to meet our rector at the time, Martin Menz, before baptism. Because Martin has a math background and had worked with Mobil Oil. And so in their conversation, Martin, who is a total teetotaler, Baptist background, said, "You work where? And you do what? What are you going to do now that you are a follower of Jesus?" And BK said, "I'm going to make the best martinis for Jesus." I'm not sure Martin knew what to do with that. But BK continued to walk with Jesus until he walked out of our lives, and as is the case sometimes, emails change and they bounce back and we don't know where he is, but God does. So as we reach, the prayer is, Lord, bring us people with hungry hearts. And look for those who are leaders and are Andrews. Everyone qualifies. But God has people who have gifts of leadership that need to be redeemed. And God has people who are Andrews, who are the quiet people who will go find the Peters. And the Peters will go and reach the masses. And an example of that is several years ago, we had a Chinese woman in our program who was granted a green card after the Tiananmen incident by George Bush. The first, she stayed, and her brother was a a gastroenterologist in westernmost province of China. And he came to present a professional paper in California and then was going to spend a 6-month period of time visiting her and her daughter. He had an ulterior motive. He was going to stay because he wanted freedom, not just for himself. He had made his career. He was at the top of he was the director of his hospital in his particular discipline. But he wanted freedom for his son, that his son would have the opportunity to go to any school he wants and study anything he wants and have a different future. And as he was with us, he began to attend both our English classes and our Bible studies, and he had such a hungry heart, and he had so many questions. And we knew that he had expressed to us a desire that he was going to stay and apply for asylum and then wait the 3 or 4 or 5 years before his wife and son could come over after he gained green card status. So he was willing to sacrifice closeness to his family to give them what he thought was the best gift. 2 weeks before his visa was to expire, he came into the office and he said, "David, I've decided to go back." And I said, "Wei Zhang, this is so surprising. Why?" He said, "I came here looking for freedom. I found something else. I found forgiveness. I can't take freedom back, but I can take forgiveness back to my family." And he got on the plane and he gave up his dream for freedom. And he went back and he shared Jesus with his wife, who became a believer, with his son, who became a believer. And he's a Han Chinese in a westernmost province that's heavily populated by Muslim Uyghurs. And what this doctor does on his day off is he goes out into the Uyghur community as a professional doctor, and that's his cover, but he prays with and he shares Jesus with people that hardly anybody else cares about or is reaching. God brings us people with hungry hearts, and Peter or Andrews and leader types. So look for those. So we're to reach, we're to teach. And I think so often we get the idea in the West that we are to teach conceptuals or concepts, ideas, lists, and things of that sort. But I think a teaching pedagogy that I really like is more is caught than is taught. They watch, they learn, and that's what penetrates their heart. And as we learn to walk alongside them and as we learn to listen to them, then God can guide us in helping them learn what it is for them to be a disciple in their shoes, not in our shoes. Because my goal is not for anybody to be like me, but it's for them to be like Jesus. Because their country needs Jesus. Their country doesn't need me. I don't want them necessarily to become an Anglican. I'm sorry. I want them to become a follower of Jesus. And so we coach and we lead by example. And then we release. And releasing, I think, is two-stage. It's giving them the opportunity as baby believers to serve while they are with us, to lead small group Bible studies, to engage, to share their story, to be a part of something that God is doing here, so that when they go back, they can already say, God has used me here. And we send them back with our blessing and the blessing of the church that knows them, that loves them, that in a sense commissions them to go back as self-supporting, bilingual, bicultural, immersion missionaries who can go back to their home people and do so much more than what others may be able to ever do. And I want you to meet someone who's that's their story, who's just walked in a couple moments ago.